also say a few words. So, Dad, could you go on?
Yeah,
Well, maybe.
I'm Greg Rodriguez.
That's my father right there.
When I was captured, I was sent to Manila, spent a week in Belgrade prison. The Japanese had told us that if anybody found out, they could kill them. They tortured those men for several days, and they made them dig their own grave, and they executed them. So happened that,
Wow. This is the most I ever heard my dad talk about the experience.
we loaded on the train and took the train from there to the Unanswered. I had an active fever in the camp, and I was unconscious for 10 days. The men were dying quite rapidly.
He had injections. Didn't know what for.
Unit 731 was created to research and study bacteriological weapons, and also for testing them out on live human beings.
What the members of Unit 731 did was to completely pervert the ideals of medicine and science.
But it was completely excised from the record.
Until the government stops the cover-up of what happened, we're never going to know.
For Emperor Hirohito and for Japanese militarism, the war was lost. Japan sued for peace.
As suddenly as it started, the war came to an end and surrender ceremonies aboard the Missouri. Without being invaded, without losing a foot of homeland, Japan was surely and utterly defeated.
I'm drawn to good stories and trying to right injustice. I got to know Martha Gellhorn very well when she lived in Wales. And at the end of the evening, she said, "You see, Peter, our job is to get it on the record, because if you don't, the bastards win." There was a unit in the Japanese Imperial Army which had carried out biological warfare experiments on human beings. And it was shocking. It was genuinely shocking.
During World War II, the Japanese fascists set up special plants in the vicinity of Harbin in northeast China for research into and manufacture of bacteriological weapons. Many Chinese citizens were used as victims of experiments with bacteriological weapons. Lest their monstrous crimes be exposed, Japanese bacteriological war criminals destroyed these plants at the time of their defeat.
And so we asked ourselves the question, so what happened to them? We decided to target as many of the Unit 731 scientists. We did find a number. One of them had become the president of the Japanese equivalent of the British Medical Association. And so we decided that we would try and confront one of them. Dr. Kasahara was an emeritus professor at a major hospital. Our plan was to walk straight in and find him. We just walked through the front door. We got in the lift, we went out to floor 5, and he was in his office sitting behind his desk. I said to him, "Good morning, we'd like to ask you about your activities working for Unit 731. And there was a long pause. And then he said, yes.
Dr. Shiro Kasahara. He's written many medical publications, some of them, I told him, undoubtedly based on his human experiments at Ping Fan.
Kasahara admitted that he was ashamed of being involved. And then he tried to mitigate that guilt by saying, but I think it was only 6 people.
But to experiment on, let alone to kill, even one is against the Geneva Convention, never mind medical ethics.
Yes, I think it was a contravention. I think the Japanese army was wrong.
That's an admission of guilt, without any doubt, very clearly. At that time, we were aware of the human experiments carried out by the Nazis in Germany. All the scientists who'd been involved in that had been prosecuted at Nuremberg. But this was one of 10,000 scientists and workers from Unit 731 who slipped back into accepted Japanese society. It's quite extraordinary.
14歳の時の写真です。試験管を毎日覗いて菌を培養しとったわけ。ひどいことがあったもんだから。この私がね、満州から帰って苦労はしましたね。徹底的に秘密で何にも言わなかった。帰ってきて会社にした時、今は一切来たくない。大学の教授が一番多いんじゃないか。あとは自分で病院を経営しても。肝心なことは全部アメリカにやっちゃったから守られたの。
Over in Tokyo, Japanese war criminals face their trial, led by ex-premiers Tojo and Shigemitsu.
At the Tokyo tribunals, no one was tried for bacteriological warfare.
Nobody in Unit 731 was prosecuted. Nobody was held accountable.
A man named Dr. Murray Sanders was on General MacArthur's staff in 1945.
My mission was biological warfare. I was to find what the Japanese had done.
That's when he began to sense the enormity of Japan's weapons campaign and impressed upon MacArthur the value of this research.
He said, well, get the data. We would not prosecute BW workers as war criminals. And the data came thick and fast after that.
What happens is that the priorities of the Cold War, and in particular the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, really started to take over the logic of the trials.
アメリカと取引をして実験データを渡して無罪になったわけですよね。
アメリカはもう初めから人体実験はやっていっただろうと分かっていたんです。それでも彼らを保護して。
The United States took that material back to use for its own purposes in developing its own weapons of mass destruction.
The Americans and Japanese were co-conspirators. The two governments orchestrated a selective amnesia about Unit 731.
But it was a secret deal that would impact the very soldiers that were fighting for the United States.
By 1942, the Japanese were celebrating victory in their first clashes with American land forces in the Philippines, Corregidor. These American troops were force-marched aboard Japanese ships, and in horrific conditions, they were taken to Korea. They were joined by about 100 British and Australian prisoners of war and boarded trains to Manchuria, to a place called Mukden.
11月11日に捕虜が到着した時の写真です。この人が桑島ジョイチ。カメラマニアだったらしくて、ここに西洋人らしい人の顔が写ってるんですね。これは遺体かもしれないです。桑島アルバムもそうですけど、それには731部隊がキャンプにやってきたっていうことがはっきり書かれてあるんです。それから金検索っていうことも書いてあるんですね。日本は米英と、戦っていたわけですね、その時ね。それはやっぱりそれでもし細菌兵器でコケーシアン、白人だから有効じゃないっていうものがあるかどうか、それから一番有効な細菌は何であるか、そういう目的で、満州に彼らを連れてきたというふうに私は考えています。
12, 14, 16, 18, 19 eggs. Oh my. And here's my dad. My father was held by the Japanese in Mukden, Manchuria. Oh, so young there. Remember that face? Huh? This was taken on the ship home after he was released. His eyes just look hollow. He's vacant. I knew early on that my dad was troubled. I mean, that wasn't explained to us, but yeah, we knew. Here, Tom. My earliest memory of him is learning how to wake him up when he was having nightmares from his experiences. I wasn't scared to do it. I just wanted to help him in any way I could. This is the NDA, non-disclosure agreement. The Japanese prisoners of war were required to sign this when they were discharged, saying that they would not discuss with anyone anything that happened while they were a prisoner of war. The United States government had said, you can't talk about it. Communications of any nature, whether by personal visit, telephone, telegraph, letters by such persons from next to kin, and on and on. My dad said we were at war. My government needs me to do this, therefore I'm not going to talk about it. For him, his patriotism and love of country superseded anything that he could have done to help himself, because there was a greater good, and I think that's how he thought of it.
August 30th, 1945, the last beachhead, Japan. The might of a free people had come at last to triumph over the lords of war. At Sugi Airport, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army Forces in the Pacific, designated Allied Supreme Commander to accept the surrender of the Japanese.
In 1949, the military tribunal at Khabarovsk, USSR, publicly tried 12 former members of the Japanese armed forces and convicted them of employing bacteriological weapons.
They had all pled guilty, and they all had confessions. The trial itself, even though it's an international attempt by the Soviets to bring this to light, it was in some measure for the Soviets to show the deficiency of the Tokyo trial.
At the Tokyo tribunals, the Americans' deal was the Japanese scientists got off scot-free, but they also got paid for the information. Some of them go on to establish corporations that became incredibly lucrative.
The Russians had imprisoned the scientists they had captured, they had prosecuted them, and they had sent them to jail for 25 years. The contrast with the way that the West treated the Unit 731 scientists couldn't be starker.
There were 12 men brought to trial, specifically charged with the crime of Unit 731's atrocities, to which General MacArthur described as an entire communist hoax. Anything and everything that America, particularly Douglas MacArthur, wanted to discredit was a communist hoax. The US government was determined to do this immunity deal rather than bring the perpetrators to justice.
I was presented with a box after Dad died. My mother gave me this box and said Dad wanted you to have it. About 200 pages of declassified, confidential and secret documents from the United States, Western Defence Command, Allied forces. The utmost secrecy is essential in order to protect the interests of the United States and to guard against embarrassment. Things like the Russians, and they kept on asking the Americans if they could interview certain Japanese individuals. The Americans kept turning them down. And these are the Americans. They knew. There's no way, they can't say they didn't, and the British can't say that they didn't know. Dad was an adventurer. He would come home from work. He'd say, right, we've got a picnic together, we're off out. It was a loving family, an absolutely amazing childhood. You don't think of your father being in a prisoner of war. You just don't. They had a hospital with Japanese doctors. Dad worked in that hospital. Dad was telling me what they were doing to his comrades, to people that he knew, operating without anesthesia. He could hear them crying, screaming. Dad wanted recognition, not just for those who'd gone through sheer hell, but also those that were being treated as guinea pigs. I had my first tumour removed in 1987. I've had 9 removed in all. Following my sister's illness, the illness of other members of the family, siblings, the questions were there. But I don't want this dark cloud hanging over me of not knowing. What was he injected with? How did it affect him? Have we got something or been given something that's altered our genetics in some way?
这幅作品是2018年创作的，表现的内容是战俘营当中的盟军士兵每天放风的一个场景，都是基于历史图片创作的。这里面的盟军吧，它有这个美国的、英国的，还有这个新西兰的。我要经常在网上查阅资料，就查到了盟军战俘营这段历史。这段历史它并记载的很少，而且我觉得这段历史是被遮蔽的历史。这些盟军的战俘来到了这个东北，受到了一些虐待。我看到这些盟军的士兵消瘦的那种身躯，我想用我一个中国画家的视角来审视这场战争。这些牺牲的战士，那么有的幸存的已经回到了自己的国家。那么有很多已经长眠于奉天的土地。对一个家庭来说，我想真是下一代都是一生的创伤，内心呢一辈子都抹不去这个阴影。
There was an orchestrated cover-up by the Japanese and U.S. government that lasted decades. I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge the harm of a prolonged cover-up and the moral harm of a prolonged silence about such a traumatic series of events.
My father ended up in Mukden, Manchuria. It was not a rosy picture. When my father was liberated, he weighed between 89 and 90 pounds, 21 years old. The American doctors told him that he would never have children because his body had deteriorated so much that it had eaten a lot of his internal organs and such. So he came back to Henrietta and got married and had 6 kids just to prove them wrong. He was in the hospital quite a lot and was absent from my life. And when he was at home, he was typically in a lot of pain. He would just randomly start suffering from fevers that would keep him bedridden for days. It impacted the way my father lived the rest of his life. He told us a story about a time that he was gravely ill. He remembers waking up and seeing a Japanese doctor waving a feather under his nose. Later, we learned that they infected feathers. That was one of the ways that they were trying to figure out how to disseminate some of these biological diseases. Years later, my father had one of these periodic fevers. The doctor ordered blood tests and found that my father had high levels of typhus in his blood. And growing up, I always wanted to measure up to the courage that he had to survive 3 years in a prison camp.
And of course, the men gathered around me and they were wanting to hide me. Said, we'll hide you where the Japanese can't find you. And I told them, I said, no. I said, if I hide.
The Japanese were indifferent to the suffering of POWs. If the Japanese were experimenting with vaccines and immunizations, it does illustrate that the doctors involved have abandoned ethics because they believe that the science is the objective, or the objective is, basically to win the war.
The Americans and Japanese orchestrated a selective amnesia about Unit 731. They pushed it into the crypt of taboo history and hoped that it never would be exhumed.
私は父親が漫画っていうのを非常に嫌って、でその反発です。で私が父親のことを調べ始めたのは今から10年くらい前から調べ始めたわけですけれども、My father. この時に初めて準尉っていう階級に上がったんです。で1644中品貿易給水部は南京にあって、でも組織としては731と全く同じ、まだ全然知られてませんけれども731と同じ組織です。向こうで作ったものと1644で作ったものを合わせて細菌戦をやってます。一番先にやっぱり疑問に思ったのが、なんで二等兵から始めて中尉までなれたんだろうかっていうのが一番不思議に思ったんです。戦争で手柄を立てるってことは要するにたくさん人を殺したとかそういうことになるわけじゃないですか。本当に聞いてなかったもんですから実態を聞けたんではないかと思って今非常に残念に思ってます。5、6年前か 5、6年前にどこかで清水さんの講演会があるっていうのを見て、でその講演会に聞きに行ったんです。それからいろいろなお付き合いをさせていただいて。こんにちは、お久しぶりです。お久しぶりです。こんにちは。
また
はい、はい、ありがとうございます。90になってから行くんだもんね。父親がそういうところにいたとすれば、まあちょっと別の問題ですけれども、非常に非人道的なことをやったっていうことになるわけですが、まあ兵隊さんっていうのは自分の意思っていうのを表すわけにはいきませんから、だから言われた命令っていうのはもう命令で絶対ですから。14歳の時に経験されたとするされた経験としては、もうこれは我々は想像できない、要するに経験だと思うんですよ。
懐かしい思いはしてきました。現地にいた時とは全然感じが違ってしまう。
ハルビンに行った時には、私は清水さんの付き添いというようなことを自分では考えてましたんで、まあ実際ああいうその現場を実際直に見せていただいたもんですから、こういうところでこういうことが行われたんだなっていうことは思って帰ってきました。清水さんが案内されたというその臓器ですとか人体解剖されたものが瓶に詰めて置いてあったっていう場所も案内していただいたわけですから、建物そのものは残ってました。
まあこれは研究のために仕方ないことだと思いますけれどね、実際その目にあった人たちの無念さ、私たちは本当にそういう無念さを強いられとったんです。内部を見た時はこんな頑固なことをやってたのかなって見てきたけどね、まああまりいい気持ちではなかったですね。本当のことを言って。戦争をさせないためにはそういうことも知らせなきゃば戦争はやまらないんじゃないかと私はそう思っております。
His testimony is very valuable because he was a living witness. It is irrefutable evidence of what happened at Unit 731. He has spoken out about this, and he wants to pass the lessons of history on to the next generation about the tragedy of war.
彼らのようやく今80年戦後80年になってようやくこうなんていうんですかね、正しい評価と批判といいますかね、そういうのを気にす歴史的な評価ができるようになったんじゃないかなというふうに思います。
ある意味被害者であり加害者です。言いたいけど言ったら自分に被害がある。非難をされるし。
その日本政府がそもそも認めてないことを、ああいうふうになかったことにしたいっていうやっぱり気持ちがあるんじゃないかなっていうふうに僕は感じてました。
そうですね、こんな話はね、もう忘れてしまった方がいいって思ってる方が多いような気がするんです。でもやったことは事実ですから、事実は事実としてやっぱりどこかできちんと残しておく必要はあると思うんです。
Good zucchini.
My father was very territorial. Wherever we lived, he would put up a fence. My daughters and I always talk about generational trauma because every house we lived in, we put up fences. I really loved my father. He was fiercely protective of his family, especially since we were girls. He had a great sense of humor, but he was also very complex, a complex man. In 1995, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and I thought, what am I going to do with my life? I said, I'll research my dad. I would stay up researching, just going down one rabbit hole after another. I started reading about how they would conduct experiments on men at Mukden. Why does everyone in the whole camp have to get this injection? What kind of shot is it? They wouldn't tell him.
There's a lot of stuff he just didn't want to talk about, so I didn't press it. He was always worried the shots were some kind of biological something that would get passed on through genes.
My dad's greatest fear was that what happened to him could be passed on to me and my sister. I have multiple sclerosis. I had kidney cancer 5 years ago, breast cancer a year ago. One of my daughters is sick with psoriatic arthritis. And you have to wonder, you know.
The United States of America will renounce the use of biological weapons. Biological warfare may profoundly affect the health of future generations.
The use of chemical and biological weapons has long been viewed with revulsion by civilized nations. No peacemaking institution can ignore the use of those dread weapons and still live up to its mission.
My grandfather was Major Robert Peaty, and he became a prisoner of war after the fall of Singapore.
Oh, I know.
This is Grandpa here.
Yes, that's right. He was officer commanding, yeah. Oh, yes.
My grandfather was sent to the POW camp at Mukden. He was the senior British officer within that camp, and he had responsibility of 100 men.
He was a really deep thinker. He used to sit for ages with his pipe puffing away in the corner. He never spoke of it at all.
That's definitely his writing, yes.
He's written here at the back, the Japanese made a practice of confiscating diaries. I was anxious to keep some record of our daily life and decided to devise some method of writing which could not be revealed to the Japanese. I set to work to learn Russian. As they knew I was studying the language, they never looked closely enough into it to detect the differences. It's the typed version that he did when he came back to the UK after he was liberated.
Major Peaty kept such great records of what was going on in the camp. If it weren't for his diaries, we might not know exactly what happened.
Major Peaty's diaries were probably the only true record of what went on in Mukden. They were that important.
13th of February 1943, about 10 Japanese medical officers and other ranks arrived today to investigate the cause of a large number of deaths. 14th of February, an enforced inoculation of the POWs. 2 Americans died in hospital, autopsies being performed on the corpses. And then on the 5th of June, inoculation, roll call outdoors. 3rd Japanese medical investigation started. Everyone had about 40 cc's of blood drawn off for a sedimentation test.
I wonder what the Japanese are doing with whatever information they found from that.
Yeah.
っていうようなことが全部記録されてるわけですよね。例えば異常な数の予防注射をしていた。本当に細かく記録してたっていうことにおいてはものすごく重要だったと思います。
The risk of maintaining a diary as a prisoner of war would have been the most terrible punishment. One of the things I'm incredibly proud of my grandfather is his foresight, gathering all these pieces of evidence together so that they are not forgotten. That he would be mindful that this would help in the jigsaw puzzle of telling the story of POWs after the war.
This was the POW reunion in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was fortunate enough that I got to meet a lot of the POW survivors. My father and some of the other POWs, they always wanted to get the truth out. You know, are these health problems that I'm having somehow related to Unit 731? This is a picture of my father and my brother. My older brother, Greg, first read about what happened at Unit 731 in the Journal of Atomic Scientists. He became obsessed with Unit 731 and whether or not these experiments had been done on my father and the other POWs. As far as I know, he's the only person who ever lobbied Congress.
I have secured a number of documents which have not been published, and I'm going to be providing them to the U.S. Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. I've had 2 hearings before Congress. At that time, I called for compensation for these men because they were subjected to some brutality during captivity.
Greg was really driving toward compensation for these men to make right what had happened to them. I remembered my brother telling me that Senator John McCain stated out loud that if there was any attempt to besmirch the reputation of Douglas MacArthur, he would not have anything to do with it. That really hampered the effort to uncover the cover-up, because it was General MacArthur that basically created the cover-up. So after years of effort, it seemed like nobody was ever going to do anything about Unit 731. Go home, don't talk about it, forget about it.
The cover-ups continued at the highest levels. Even to this day, it's an effort between Japan and the United States government to suppress knowledge about it.
All of us have struggled to deal with it in our own way. My father's POW experience has been probably the core experience that the rest of my life has been wrapped around. There are so many children of survivors, and I think they all deserve to know.
Our government must bear the responsibility for denying us the information from the files that they obtained from the Unit 731 experiments. Why have many of our group died suddenly in their 50s? Why have our children suffered unexplained illnesses? Why are such illnesses showing in our grandchildren? That's just so incredibly sad and so unjust. It's the legacy of war. It doesn't stop when peace papers are signed. It continues for many, many families. They've each got their story to tell. Here we are, 80 years later, and there is still so much unknown. The silence that surrounded these individuals, their lived experience, is quite overwhelming.
Daddy, I wrote you a song. Now you remember how well I sing, Daddy, so don't criticize. I grew up in the shadow of the great world war. Try to have courage like my father did before. Searching for the answers so I can bring them to the light. A family legacy, I'll never give up the fight. 'Cause it's a miracle I'm even here at all. I love you, Dad.